I watched through my living room window as the oil delivery truck pulled up to my driveway for the third time this month, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. Sure enough, before the driver could even step out of his cab, a burgundy Lexus came screeching around the corner, blocking the truck's path to my oil tank. Deborah Patterson, the HOA president of Willow Creek Estates in Concord, New Hampshire, had arrived right on schedule to make my life miserable once again. My name is Henry Lawson, and I had moved into this supposedly quiet neighborhood 6 months ago after my divorce was finalized. I needed a fresh start, somewhere peaceful where I could focus on my consulting work from home and maybe find some normalcy again. The house was a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms, a decent backyard, and central heating supplemented by an oil furnace for those brutal New England winters. Everything seemed perfect until I met Deborah. She was 52 years old with that distinctive Karen haircut, the one that screams, "I want to speak to your manager," from a mile away. Blonde highlights that were clearly box dye, oversized sunglasses perched on her head even in winter, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of athletic wear, despite the fact that I had never seen her exercise once. From day one, she had taken issue with virtually everything about my property. The oil delivery driver, a guy named Mike who I had gotten to know pretty well over these months, climbed out of his truck with an exasperated expression. I grabbed my coat and headed outside before things could escalate. "You cannot park that truck here," Deborah announced, her voice carrying that shrill quality that made my teeth ache. She was standing next to her Lexus with her arms crossed, looking absolutely triumphant. "Madam, I am making a delivery to Mr. Lawson's residence," Mike said with the patience of someone who dealt with difficult customers daily. "His oil tank is around back, and I need access to his driveway. The HOA has determined that commercial vehicles are not permitted to park on residential driveways for extended periods," Deborah said, pulling out a printed document from her oversized purse. "It is in violation of our community standards, Section 12, Paragraph 4. I stepped between them, feeling my blood pressure rising. "Deborah, this is the 3rd time you have blocked my oil delivery. Mike is not parking here for an extended period. He needs maybe 20 minutes to fill my tank so I can heat my house. It is 15 degrees outside." "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before purchasing a home in a community with standards, Henry," she said, pronouncing my name like it was something distasteful. "There are rules here, and everyone must follow them. If we make exceptions for you, then everyone will want exceptions." "What exceptions?" I said, my voice getting louder. "Everyone in this neighborhood gets oil deliveries. I have seen the trucks at the Morrison place, at the Chen residence, at your own house, for crying out loud." "My deliveries are scheduled and approved through the proper HOA channels," Deborah said smugly. "You failed to submit the required commercial vehicle access form at least 72 hours in advance. Therefore, this delivery cannot proceed." Mike looked at me with sympathy. "Mr. Lawson, I have other stops today. I can try to come back tomorrow if you can get this sorted out." "No, Mike, wait," I said, pulling out my phone. "Deborah, I have email records showing that I submitted that exact form 4 days ago. You responded saying it was received." "I have no record of approving it," she said, examining her manicured nails. "Reception and approval are 2 different things, Henry. Perhaps you should read the bylaws more carefully." The absolute ridiculousness of the situation was making my head spin. I had been dealing with Deborah's nonsense since I moved in, starting with a violation notice about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black, then another about my trash cans being visible from the street for 15 minutes past the pickup time, and most recently a formal complaint because my car was parked at a slight angle in my own driveway. But this was different. This was not about aesthetics or petty rules. This was about my ability to heat my home during a New Hampshire winter. Deborah, I am down to a quarter tank. If I do not get this delivery today, I will run out of oil by tomorrow night, I said, trying to keep my voice level. You cannot seriously expect me to freeze because of bureaucratic nonsense. I expect you to follow the rules like everyone else, she said. Now, if this truck is not moved in the next 5 minutes, I will call a towing company and have it removed at your expense, Mr. Lawson. Mike held up his hands. Look, I do not need this hassle. Mr. Lawson, call the office and reschedule. I am sorry, man. He climbed back into his truck, maneuvered around Deborah's Lexus with considerable difficulty, and drove away. I stood there in my driveway, watching my heat source disappear down the street while Deborah looked absolutely delighted with herself. I am glad we could resolve this situation appropriately, she said, climbing back into her car. I trust you will follow proper procedures for your next delivery attempt. Oh, and Henry, I noticed your front lawn needs attention. The grass is looking patchy near your walkway. That is a violation of our landscaping standards. You will be receiving a formal notice by end of day. She drove off, leaving me standing in the cold, absolutely furious. I went back inside and immediately called the oil company, where a sympathetic dispatcher named Carol told me the earliest they could reschedule was 3 days out due to high demand during the cold snap. I explained my situation, including the HOA interference, and she said she would try to fit me in sooner but could not make any promises. Next, I called my lawyer, Patricia Gomez, who had handled my divorce and told me to reach out if I ever needed anything. When I explained what had just happened, she listened carefully and then sighed. Henry, HOA disputes are tricky, she said. Technically, if the bylaws state that you need approval for commercial vehicle access, they can enforce that. However, denying you essential services like heating oil could potentially be argued as unreasonable. Let me review your HOA documents and see what we are working with. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every email, every phone call. I spent the rest of that day doing exactly that. I went through my email records and found that I had indeed submitted the proper form 4 days in advance. Deborah had responded with a one-line acknowledgement that said, "Form received." There was no mention of approval being required as a separate step, and nowhere in the HOA bylaws could I find language stating that reception and approval were different processes. The bylaws simply stated that residents must notify the HOA 72 hours before commercial vehicle access. Notify, not request approval. That night, I kept my thermostat at 65 degrees to conserve oil, bundled up in a sweatshirt, and started researching HOA law in New Hampshire. What I found was both enlightening and infuriating. HOAs had broad powers to enforce their bylaws, but they also had obligations to act reasonably and in good faith. Denying access to essential services could potentially violate those obligations, especially if the denial was based on a misinterpretation or misapplication of the rules. The next morning, I woke up to find a formal violation notice tucked into my front door. It was printed on official Willow Creek Estates letterhead and detailed my supposed lawn violation, complete with photos that Deborah must have taken. The notice stated that I had 7 days to remedy the situation or face a fine of $250. The photos showed a tiny patch of slightly brown grass, maybe 6 inches in diameter, near my front walkway. It was the kind of minor imperfection that every lawn in the neighborhood probably had, I photographed the notice, added it to my growing documentation file, and sent it to Patricia. Then, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I drove around the neighborhood with my phone, taking pictures of other properties. The Morrison place had a downspout that was visibly damaged and hanging loose. The Chen residence had holiday decorations still up even though it was mid-January. 3 houses down from mine, someone had a basketball hoop in their driveway that looked like it violated the same commercial equipment rules Deborah was trying to enforce against my oil delivery. Most interestingly, when I drove past Deborah's house on Maple Ridge Drive, I noticed several things. Her lawn had similar patchy areas. One of her shutters was slightly crooked, and sitting in her driveway was a landscaping trailer that had clearly been there for hours, based on the snow accumulation around its tires. I took pictures of everything and sent them to Patricia with a note. "Selective enforcement," she called me back within an hour. "Henry, this is good. If you can show that Deborah is enforcing rules selectively and targeting you specifically, we might have grounds for a harassment claim. But I need you to be strategic here. Do not confront her directly. Keep documenting, stay calm, and let me build a case." "Patricia, I am going to run out of oil tomorrow night," I said. "Being strategic is great, but I also need to not freeze to death." "I understand. Let me make some calls." "In the meantime, do you have any alternative heating options?" I looked around my house. "I have a fireplace, but it is decorative and not really designed for sustained use. I have space heaters in the garage, but running those constantly would cost a fortune in electricity and probably trip my breakers." "Use what you need to stay warm," Patricia said. "Keep all receipts. If we can prove that Deborah's actions directly caused you financial harm, that strengthens our position." I spent that afternoon setting up space heaters throughout my house and watching my oil gauge drop. By evening, I was down to 1/8 of a tank. I kept the thermostat at 60 degrees, wore layers of clothing, and tried to focus on work, but concentration was impossible. Every time the furnace kicked on, I thought about how much closer I was getting to having no heat at all. That night, around 8 o'clock, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found my neighbor from across the street, an older gentleman named Robert Morrison, standing there with a concerned expression. "Henry, I heard about what happened with your oil delivery," he said. "Deborah came by my house today asking if I had noticed any violations at your property. She is on a real crusade against you, son." "Tell me about it," I said, inviting him inside. "Did she say why she has such a problem with me specifically?" Robert settled into my living room chair and accepted the coffee I offered him. "My wife and I have lived here for 15 years, and we have seen Deborah go after people before. Usually, it is because they challenged her on something or did not treat her with what she considers appropriate respect." "Did you have a run-in with her when you first moved in?" I thought back to my first week in the house. At the welcome meeting, she was explaining all the rules, and when she got to the part about trash cans, I mentioned that the wording in the bylaws was vague. I suggested clarifying it so people would know exactly what was expected. She did not like that much. Robert nodded knowingly. "That would do it. Deborah does not like anyone questioning her authority or interpretation of the rules. She sees herself as the guardian of neighborhood standards, and anyone who challenges that becomes a target. Last year, she went after the Hendersons because Mrs. Henderson suggested at a meeting that the HOA fees were too high. They ended up moving rather than deal with the constant violation notices." "That is insane," I said. "How does she get away with this?" "Most people do not want to fight. HOA battles are expensive and time-consuming, and Deborah has the resources to drag things out. Plus, she has allies on the board. Her best friend Linda serves as treasurer, and her husband's golf buddy is the vice president. They basically rubber stamp whatever Deborah wants. This was valuable information. Robert, would you be willing to provide a statement about Deborah's pattern of selective enforcement? My lawyer is building a case. He hesitated. Henry, I want to help, but I also have to live here. If I get on Deborah's bad side, she will make our lives miserable too. I understood completely, and I did not blame him. I get it. Thanks for the heads up, at least. After Robert left, I sat in my increasingly cold house and tried to figure out my next move. The temperature had dropped to 58 degrees despite the space heaters running. My oil tank was nearly empty, and I had no guarantee that my next delivery would not be blocked again. Then an idea started forming. It was petty, possibly vindictive, but given what Deborah had put me through, I was past caring about taking the high road. I pulled up the Willow Creek Estate's bylaws on my laptop and started reading through them carefully, section by section. If Deborah wanted to play games with technicalities and selective enforcement, I could do the same. It took me 2 hours, but I finally found what I was looking for. Section 18. Paragraph 7 stated that all residential heating systems must be maintained in working order, and that any resident whose heating system posed a safety risk to neighboring properties could be subject to immediate inspection and remediation orders. Section 23. Paragraph 2 stated that any resident could file a formal complaint about potential safety violations, and the HOA board was required to investigate within 48 hours. I started drafting a formal complaint, being very careful with my wording. I did not make any false claims, but I did note that I had observed unusual fluctuations in Deborah's chimney smoke output, suggesting possible heating system issues. I mentioned concerns about carbon monoxide and fire safety. I requested that the HOA board conduct an immediate inspection of her heating system to ensure it met all safety standards. The beautiful irony was that if Deborah's oil delivery was even slightly delayed, or if she faced any of the same bureaucratic hurdles she had imposed on me, she would experience exactly what I was going through. I submitted the complaint through the HOA's online portal at 10 o'clock that night, including all the required documentation and references to the relevant bylaw sections. The system generated an automatic confirmation email stating that my complaint had been received and would be reviewed by the board. The next morning, I woke up to a frigid house. My oil tank had run dry sometime during the night, and the temperature inside had dropped to 52 degrees. I cranked up the space heaters, wrapped myself in blankets, and called the oil company again. Carol, the sympathetic dispatcher, told me she had managed to move my delivery up to that afternoon around 2 o'clock. Please make sure the driver has my lawyer's contact information, I said. If the HOA president tries to block the delivery again, I need him to call Patricia Gomez immediately before leaving. I will put a note on the work order, Carol promised. Hang in there, Mr. Lawson. Around 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It was an unknown local number, but I answered anyway. Mr. Lawson, this is Linda Pemberton, treasurer of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, said a woman's voice that sounded distinctly unfriendly. I am calling regarding your complaint filed last night about Deborah Patterson's property. Yes, I filed that complaint in accordance with the bylaws, I said carefully. Is there a problem? The problem, Mr. Lawson, is that you are clearly filing frivolous complaints in retaliation for legitimate enforcement actions. This is a misuse of HOA resources and could be grounds for additional violations. I disagree that my concerns are frivolous, I said. The bylaws require residents to maintain safe heating systems. I have observed concerning signs and followed the proper procedure for reporting them. Unless you are suggesting that some residents are exempt from safety inspections." There was a long pause. "The board will review your complaint as required, but I am warning you, Mr. Lawson, that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. If you continue to abuse the complaint system, we will take appropriate action." "I look forward to the results of the inspection," I said, and ended the call. I immediately called Patricia and told her about the conversation. She sounded pleased. "They are scared. Linda calling you directly and trying to intimidate you into withdrawing the complaint shows that they know you have found a legitimate pressure point. They have to conduct the inspection. Or you can file a complaint with the state about the HOA failing to meet its safety obligations. But if they do conduct the inspection and find nothing wrong, they look petty for going after you while you are without heat. Either way, you have put them in an uncomfortable position. I just want my oil delivery to go through without interference," I said. "It will. I have already sent a formal letter to Deborah and the HOA board stating that any further interference with your essential services will result in immediate legal action, including injunctions and damages. I sent it certified mail this morning, and I emailed copies as well." At 2:15 that afternoon, the oil truck arrived. I watched anxiously from my window, expecting Deborah's Lexus to come flying around the corner at any moment, but the street remained quiet. Mike, the driver, gave me a wave and went about his work, running the hose to my tank and starting the pump. I stood outside in the cold, keeping watch until the delivery was complete. "Any problems?" I asked Mike. "Smooth as silk," he said. "Got a note from dispatch about potential HOA interference, but nobody showed up. You are all set, Mr. Lawson. Full tank." I could have kissed him. Instead, I tipped him $50 and thanked him profusely. As the truck pulled away, I went back inside and cranked my heat up to a comfortable 68 degrees. The furnace kicked on, and I felt the warm air starting to flow through the vents. It was the best feeling I had experienced in days, but my relief was short-lived. Around 4 o'clock, I received an email from the HOA board. It was a formal notice stating that, per my complaint, they would be conducting a heating system inspection at Deborah Patterson's residence the following morning at 9 o'clock. As the complainant, I was invited to be present during the inspection if I wished. I absolutely wished. The email also included a second notice, this one addressed to me. Apparently, the board had reviewed my complaint and had decided that given the serious nature of heating system safety, they would be conducting comprehensive inspections of all properties in the neighborhood over the next 2 weeks. My property was scheduled for inspection 3 days from now. I forwarded everything to Patricia, who called me back laughing. "They are trying to bury you in reciprocal bureaucracy. Classic HOA power play, but they have made a tactical error. If they are inspecting everyone, they cannot claim selective enforcement anymore. And if they find minor issues with your system, we can point to the fact that you were without heat because of their interference, which caused any problems to be exacerbated." The next morning, I arrived at Deborah's house at 8:55. Her Lexus was in the driveway, along with Linda's silver Mercedes and another car I did not recognize. When Deborah opened the door, her expression was pure venom. "Henry, how nice of you to join us," she said with fake sweetness. "I do hope you are satisfied with the circus you have created." "Just exercising my rights under the bylaws," I said pleasantly. "The same rights you have exercised so diligently regarding my property." The inspector arrived at 9 sharp. He was a certified HVAC technician named Tom Brennan, hired by the HOA specifically for these inspections. He seemed professional and uninterested in the politics of the situation, which I appreciated. "Madam, I will need access to your furnace, oil tank, thermostat, and all heating vents," he told Deborah. "This will take approximately an hour." We all trooped down to Deborah's basement, where her heating system was located. Tom went to work with his equipment, checking connections, testing airflow, and examining the oil tank. I stayed quiet, just observing and taking mental notes. After about 20 minutes, Tom frowned and pulled out a more specialized piece of equipment. "Mrs. Patterson, when was your last heating system maintenance?" "I do not see how that is relevant," Deborah said stiffly. "It is relevant because your heat exchanger is showing signs of corrosion, and your flue pipe has some concerning deterioration," Tom said. "Based on what I am seeing, I would estimate this system has not been professionally serviced in at least 3 to 4 years. Linda jumped in. "Tom, we hired you to inspect for safety violations, not to provide maintenance recommendations." "This is not a recommendation, madam. This is a safety issue," Tom said firmly. The corrosion on the heat exchanger could lead to cracks, which would allow combustion gases, including carbon monoxide, to enter the living space. The flue pipe deterioration could cause similar problems. I am required by my licensing to report these conditions. Deborah's face had gone pale. "Well, I will have it serviced then. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." "I am afraid it is more serious than that," Tom said, taking photos with his camera. "Based on the extent of the deterioration, I am recommending immediate shutdown of this system until repairs can be completed by a licensed professional. Continued operation poses a legitimate safety risk." I fought to keep my expression neutral. This was almost too perfect. "You cannot shut down my heat," Deborah said, her voice rising. "It is January in New Hampshire. That is completely unreasonable. Madam, I am not shutting down your heat. I am making a professional recommendation based on safety standards," Tom said. "You are free to ignore that recommendation, but I will be including it in my report to the HOA, and my company will not be liable for any incidents that occur if you continue operating this system." Linda was frantically whispering something to Deborah, but I could see the panic in both their faces. The irony was overwhelming. Deborah had blocked my access to heating oil, causing me to nearly freeze, and now her own heating system was being red-tagged for safety violations. Tom completed his inspection, wrote up his report, and provided copies to both Deborah and the HOA board representatives. His final recommendation was clear. Heating system should be shut down immediately and not operated until repairs are completed by a licensed HVAC contractor. As we all filed out of Deborah's house, I finally spoke up. "Deborah, if you need recommendations for temporary heating solutions, I found that space heaters work reasonably well. They are not as efficient as a proper furnace, but they will keep you from freezing. Of course, you will need to be careful not to overload your electrical system." The look she gave me could have melted steel. "Get off my property, Henry." I drove home feeling a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. Satisfaction because Deborah was finally experiencing consequences for her actions, but guilt because I had not actually wanted anyone to be without heat. I had just wanted her to understand what she had put me through. That afternoon, Patricia called with an update. "The HOA board is in chaos." Linda Pemberton called me trying to negotiate. Apparently, Deborah needs to replace her entire heating system, which will take at least a week, maybe more given the current demand for HVAC work. "They want you to withdraw your complaint in exchange for them dropping all violations against your property." "What do you think?" I asked. "I think we can do better," Patricia said. "They are desperate, which means we have leverage." I am going to propose a settlement agreement that includes the following. All current and pending violations against your property are dismissed. You receive a formal apology from the board for the interference with your oil delivery. The HOA bylaws are amended to clarify that notification of commercial vehicle access is sufficient, and that approval cannot be unreasonably withheld for essential services. And Deborah Patterson steps down as HOA president. You think they will go for that? The first 3 points, definitely. The last one might be harder, but given that this entire situation stems from Deborah's personal vendetta against you and her abuse of her position, I think we have a strong argument. If they refuse, we can pursue legal action for harassment and intentional interference with essential services. That would be expensive for them and very embarrassing. Over the next 2 days, I watched the drama unfold from my comfortably heated house. Deborah had space heaters installed throughout her home, but the temperature still dropped significantly, especially at night. I saw her Mercedes parked at the house instead of her Lexus, which meant her husband was also dealing with the situation. The HVAC company van was there for several hours on the second day, presumably giving estimates for the heating system replacement. Meanwhile, Tom Brennan began conducting inspections at other houses in the neighborhood. Most passed without issues, though a few received recommendations for minor maintenance. The word spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened at Deborah's house and the connection to her blocking my oil delivery. Robert Morrison stopped by one evening with his wife, Susan. "Henry, people are talking," he said. "Some of the neighbors are saying you deliberately filed a false complaint to get back at Deborah." "The complaint was not false," I said firmly. "Tom Brennan found legitimate safety issues that Deborah had neglected. If anything, I potentially saved her and her family from a dangerous situation." "That is what we have been telling people," Susan said. "The truth is, a lot of folks are tired of Deborah's power trips. Last year, she tried to fine the Nguyen family for having too many cars in their driveway when their daughter was visiting from college. Before that, she went after the Martinez family for having a vegetable garden that she claimed violated landscaping standards. Everyone is too afraid to stand up to her." "Well, maybe that is about to change," I said. On the third day after the inspection, Patricia called with news. "They have agreed to all our terms. All violations dismissed, formal apology, bylaw amendments, everything. Including Deborah's resignation as HOA president." I was stunned. Seriously, she agreed to step down. She did not have much choice. Apparently, several other board members were already unhappy with her leadership style, and this situation was the final straw. They gave her the option of resigning voluntarily or being removed by a vote of no confidence. She chose resignation. The formal announcement will be made at next week's HOA meeting. That is incredible. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for being organized and documenting everything. That made my job much easier. I will send you the settlement agreement to review, but assuming you approve it, we should have everything finalized by the end of the week. The HOA meeting the following Tuesday was the most well-attended one in the neighborhood's history. Nearly every household sent a representative, everyone curious to see the fallout from the heating system saga. I arrived early and sat in the back, wanting to observe rather than be the center of attention. Deborah was there, looking smaller somehow, her usual confidence replaced with barely concealed anger. Linda called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "As many of you have heard, we have had some unusual circumstances over the past week involving heating system inspections and questions about HOA enforcement procedures," Linda said carefully. "After extensive discussion with our legal counsel, The board has agreed to several changes. First, we are amending our bylaws to clarify that notification for commercial vehicle access to essential services like heating oil delivery is sufficient, and that approval cannot be unreasonably withheld. Second, we are implementing new procedures to ensure consistent and fair enforcement of all HOA rules across all properties. She paused and glanced at Deborah before continuing. Finally, Deborah Patterson has chosen to step down as HOA president, effective immediately. We thank her for her years of service to the community and wish her well. The board will hold elections for a new president at next month's meeting. There was a moment of shocked silence, followed by a ripple of whispers throughout the room. Deborah stood up abruptly. "I want to make something very clear," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I have dedicated 5 years to this community, working tirelessly to maintain our property values and uphold our standards. The fact that I am being forced out because one person decided to weaponize our safety procedures against me is an absolute travesty. Henry Lawson filed a baseless complaint purely for revenge, and now this board is rewarding his vindictive behavior." I felt everyone's eyes turn toward me, but I kept my expression neutral and said nothing. Tom Brennan, who had been invited to the meeting to present his findings, stood up. "Mrs. Patterson, with all due respect, the complaint was not baseless. Your heating system had significant safety issues that posed a real risk to you and your family. Mr. Lawson's complaint may have been motivated by personal conflict, but that does not change the fact that the safety violations were real and needed to be addressed." "The timing was suspicious at best," Deborah shot back. "The timing was actually fortunate," Tom said calmly. "If those issues had gone unaddressed for another few months, you could have faced a serious carbon monoxide incident. As a safety professional, I am grateful the inspection occurred when it did, regardless of the motivation behind the complaint." Robert Morrison raised his hand. "I have a question for the board. Will the new enforcement procedures address concerns about selective enforcement? Because I think a lot of us have noticed that some properties seem to receive more scrutiny than others." Linda looked uncomfortable. "The new procedures will include a rotation system for routine inspections and a standardized process for handling complaints. We are committed to fair and consistent enforcement going forward." The meeting continued for another hour, covering various neighborhood business, but the tension never fully dissipated. When it finally ended, several neighbors approached me with words of support and thanks for standing up to Deborah's bullying. A few others gave me cold looks, clearly viewing me as a troublemaker. Deborah left without speaking to anyone, her husband following behind her looking exhausted. As I was leaving, Linda caught up with me in the parking lot. "Mr. Lawson, I owe you an apology. When I called you after your complaint, I made assumptions and acted unprofessionally. That was wrong, and I am sorry." I was surprised by her honesty. "Thank you. I appreciate that. For what it is worth, I think the changes we are implementing are positive for the community," she said. Deborah was a friend, but she let the power go to her head. Hopefully, whoever becomes the next president will have better balance. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal. Deborah's heating system was replaced, a process that took nearly 2 weeks and reportedly cost over $12,000. My own heating system inspection found only minor recommendations, all of which I addressed promptly. The neighborhood seemed calmer somehow, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. The HOA elections were held in February, and a retired teacher named Margaret Foster was elected as the new president. She immediately instituted monthly open forums where residents could voice concerns and suggestions without fear of retaliation. The difference in atmosphere was remarkable. My life settled into a comfortable routine. Work was going well, my house was warm, and I was no longer dreading every interaction with the HOA. I even started attending the monthly meetings, wanting to stay informed and engaged with the community. In March, something unexpected happened. I was outside raking up some early spring debris when Deborah pulled up in her Lexus and rolled down her window. "Henry, could I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual edge. I set down my rake and walked over. "Sure, Deborah. What is up?" She seemed to struggle with her words before finally speaking. "I wanted to apologize. What I did, blocking your oil delivery, that was wrong. I was on a power trip, and I let personal feelings override common sense and basic decency. You could have frozen because of my actions, and that is inexcusable." I was genuinely surprised. "Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I have been doing a lot of thinking since stepping down from the HOA," she continued. "I lost perspective somewhere along the way. I started seeing rule enforcement as a personal crusade rather than a service to the community. What you did, filing that complaint, it was clever and definitely motivated by revenge, but it also probably saved my family from a serious safety issue. So thank you for that, I guess." "You are welcome," I said. "For what it is worth, I did not actually want you to be without heat. I just wanted you to understand what it felt like." "Message received," she said with a small, rueful smile. "Anyway, I will let you get back to your yard work. And Henry, that patch of grass by your walkway has filled in nicely. Looks great." She drove away, and I stood there for a moment processing the conversation. It was not a complete redemption arc, but it was something. An acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an apology, and maybe the beginning of becoming neighbors instead of enemies. The following week, I was having coffee with Robert and Susan Morrison when Robert mentioned something interesting. "Did you hear? Deborah and her husband are putting their house on the market. They are moving to South Carolina to be closer to their daughter." "Really?" I said. "I just talked to her last week, and she did not mention anything about moving." "Apparently, the whole HOA situation was just the final straw," Susan said. "Between that and some issues with her husband's business, they decided it was time for a fresh start. Can't say I blame them, really. Must be hard to live in a place where everyone knows about your very public fall from grace." I felt a pang of sympathy. Yes, Deborah had been unreasonable and vindictive, but I had not intended to drive her out of the neighborhood entirely. "Don't feel bad," Robert said, reading my expression. "This is not on you. Deborah made her choices, and those choices had consequences. You just stood up for yourself, which is exactly what you should have done." "Robert is right," Susan added. "Besides, from what I hear, they have been talking about moving south for years." This just accelerated the timeline. Over the next month, I watched Deborah's house go through the selling process. It sold quickly, and by late April, a moving truck was parked in her driveway, loading up her belongings. I happened to be checking my mail when she walked over for what I assumed would be a final goodbye. "Well, this is it," she said. "We are heading out tomorrow morning. New house in Charleston, South Carolina. My daughter is pregnant with our first grandchild, so the timing worked out." "Congratulations on becoming a grandmother," I said sincerely. "I hope the move goes smoothly and that South Carolina treats you well." "Thank you. And Henry, I meant what I said about apologizing. I have had a lot of time to reflect, and I realize I became exactly the kind of person I always disliked: rigid, controlling, and mean-spirited. I am hoping this move gives me a chance to reset and do better." "I think that is really admirable," I said. "It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes and make changes." She smiled, and for the first time since I had met her, it seemed genuine. Take care of yourself, Henry, and good luck with the new HOA president. Margaret seems like a good person. She is. Take care, Deborah. I watched her walk back to her house and disappear inside. The next morning, a large moving truck pulled away from her house, followed by her Lexus, and that was the last I saw of Deborah Patterson. Life in Willow Creek Estates continued peacefully under Margaret Foster's leadership. The heavy-handed enforcement tactics were replaced with reasonable communication and community cooperation. Violation notices became rare, reserved for genuine issues rather than petty grievances. The neighborhood felt like an actual community rather than a collection of properties under surveillance. In May, I attended the HOA's annual spring meeting where they reviewed the changes implemented over the past few months. Margaret presented statistics showing that resident satisfaction was up significantly. Complaints were down, and overall neighborhood morale was better than it had been in years. "I want to thank everyone for embracing these changes," Margaret said. "An HOA should serve its residents, not rule over them. Our job is to maintain property values and community standards, yes, but also to create a place where people actually want to live, where neighbors support each other instead of reporting each other for minor infractions." There was enthusiastic applause, and I found myself genuinely appreciating the transformation that had occurred. What had started as a miserable conflict with an unreasonable HOA president had ultimately led to positive systemic changes that benefited everyone. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to chat. Some thanked me again for standing up to Deborah. Others shared their own stories of her excessive enforcement tactics. A few expressed relief that they could finally relax in their own homes without constantly worrying about violation notices. One neighbor, Jennifer Chen, pulled me aside with a conspiratorial smile. "You know what the best part is? My kids can actually play basketball in the driveway now without me freaking out about the noise level. Last summer, Deborah sent us 3 violation notices because the ball was supposedly creating excessive recreational noise during approved hours." Margaret's response when I asked about it: "They are kids playing basketball. That is what neighborhoods are supposed to sound like." These small stories reinforced how much Deborah's leadership style had negatively impacted daily life for so many residents. While I had not set out to become a neighborhood hero, I was glad that my conflict with her had led to meaningful improvements. Summer arrived, and I settled into a comfortable routine of work and leisure. My house was running smoothly, my relationship with the HOA was positive, and I was actually making friends among my neighbors. Robert and Susan Morrison became regular companions for weekend barbecues. The Chen family invited me to their daughter's graduation party. Even Linda Pemberton, once Deborah's staunch ally, became friendlier, occasionally stopping to chat when our paths crossed. One particularly warm evening in July, I was sitting on my back deck enjoying a beer when my phone rang. It was Patricia Gomez, my lawyer. "Henry, I wanted to give you a heads up about something," she said. "I just received a certified letter from Deborah Patterson's attorney in South Carolina. Apparently, she is filing a lawsuit against the HOA and Tom Brennan, the inspector, claiming that the heating system inspection was conducted improperly and that the subsequent publicity damaged her reputation and forced her to sell her house at a loss." My stomach dropped. "Is she including me in the lawsuit?" "Not directly, but you are mentioned extensively in the complaint as the person who filed the allegedly malicious complaint that started everything. They are trying to argue that you, the HOA, and Tom Brennan conspired to force her out of her position and damage her financially." "That is insane," I said. Tom found legitimate safety violations. The HOA conducted the inspection according to their own bylaws, and she resigned voluntarily. I agree completely, and I think any court would see it the same way, Patricia said. But I wanted you to be aware. You will likely be called as a witness if this goes to trial. Start refreshing your memory on everything that happened and make sure you still have all your documentation. I do. I kept everything. Good. I will keep you updated as this develops. Try not to worry too much. Frankly, this lawsuit sounds more like sour grapes than a legitimate legal claim. Over the next few months, the lawsuit progressed slowly through the courts. Deborah's attorney filed extensive motions and discovery requests, trying to build a case that she had been unfairly targeted and harassed. The HOA's insurance company provided legal representation, and Tom Brennan's professional liability insurance did the same for him. I provided a deposition in September, recounting the entire sequence of events from my perspective. Deborah's attorney was aggressive, trying to paint me as a vindictive troublemaker who had filed a false complaint for revenge. But my documentation was thorough, and Patricia had prepared me well for the questioning. Mr. Lawson, is it not true that you filed your complaint about Mrs. Patterson's heating system immediately after she blocked your oil delivery? The attorney asked. I filed it the same evening, yes, I said calmly. And you would agree that the timing suggests retaliation rather than genuine concern. No, I would not agree with that. The timing suggests that Mrs. Patterson's actions made me more aware of HOA bylaws and enforcement procedures. When I reviewed the bylaws in detail, I noticed language about heating system safety. I had previously observed concerning signs from Mrs. Patterson's property, and I decided to file a formal complaint following the proper procedures. What concerning signs had you observed? Unusual smoke patterns from her chimney, and during a neighborhood conversation, she had mentioned having occasional issues with her heat. Those things, combined with the safety language in the bylaws, prompted my complaint. The attorney tried several more approaches, but I stuck to the facts. Tom Brennan's deposition was even more damaging to Deborah's case, as he provided detailed technical explanations of the safety violations he had found, and the standard industry protocols he had followed during the inspection. In November, I received word from Patricia that Deborah's lawsuit had been dismissed. The judge ruled that Tom Brennan had conducted a legitimate safety inspection following industry standards. The HOA had acted within its authority and bylaws, and there was no evidence of conspiracy or malicious intent. The judge noted that while the timing of my complaint might have been motivated by personal conflict, the safety violations found were real and substantiated, which meant the complaint itself was valid regardless of motivation. Deborah was ordered to pay the HOA's legal fees and Tom Brennan's defense costs, though Patricia told me those would likely be covered by insurance rather than coming directly from Deborah's pocket. That is the end of it, Patricia said. She has no grounds for appeal, and I seriously doubt she would try given how thoroughly the judge rejected her claims. You are free and clear, Henry. I felt an enormous sense of relief. The lawsuit had been hanging over me for months, creating background stress even when I tried not to think about it. Now it was finally, definitively over. The holidays that year were peaceful and enjoyable. The neighborhood held a winter festival organized by Margaret and the HOA, complete with ice skating, hot chocolate, and a Santa meet and greet for the kids. It was the kind of community event that would have been unthinkable under Deborah's rigid, rule-focused leadership. As the new year rolled around, marking roughly a year since the whole oil delivery incident had occurred, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. I had moved to Willow Creek Estates looking for a quiet, drama-free place to rebuild my life after divorce. Instead, I had ended up in a bizarre conflict with an unreasonable HOA president that had somehow resulted in her resignation, a neighborhood-wide policy reform, and ultimately a better community for everyone. The irony was not lost on me that Deborah's attempt to make my life miserable by blocking my heating oil had backfired so spectacularly. If she had just let that delivery go through, or if she had been reasonable at any point in our interactions, none of the subsequent events would have occurred. Her own inflexibility and vindictiveness had created the circumstances for her downfall. But I also recognized that I had played my part in escalating things. Filing that complaint about her heating system was strategic and calculated, designed to put pressure on her the same way she had pressured me. I had not made false claims, but I had definitely weaponized the HOA's own procedures against her. Was that wrong? I still was not entirely sure. What I did know was that the outcome had been broadly positive for the neighborhood. The enforcement changes, the new leadership, the shift in community culture, all of that had made Willow Creek Estates a genuinely better place to live. Sometimes it takes a conflict to reveal systemic problems and create opportunities for improvement. In February, Margaret Foster was re-elected as HOA president by a landslide. Her speech at the meeting focused on continuing the community-first approach that had defined her first year in office. "We have learned that an HOA works best when it serves residents rather than policing them," she said. "Rules have their place, but so do common sense, flexibility, and basic human kindness. Let us continue building a neighborhood where people feel welcome, supported, and proud to live." The applause was long and heartfelt. As I looked around at my neighbors, I saw faces that looked genuinely happy and engaged rather than wary and stressed. That, more than anything, validated the difficult journey we had all been through. After the meeting, Robert Morrison pulled me aside. "You know, Henry, when you first moved in and started having issues with Deborah, Susan and I wondered how it would all play out. I will admit, we were skeptical that anything would change. But you stuck to your guns, documented everything, and ultimately made things better for all of us. I wanted to say thank you for that." "I appreciate it, Robert, though honestly, I was mostly just trying to get my oil delivered so I would not freeze," he laughed. "Maybe so, but the result was bigger than that. You showed people that standing up to unfair treatment is possible and worthwhile. That is valuable." As I drove home that night, I thought about the strange trajectory my life had taken. A year ago, I had been sitting in my freezing house, furious and frustrated, watching my heating options disappear because of one person's power trip. Now, I was living comfortably in a reformed neighborhood with actual friendships and a sense of community belonging. The house that had felt like a battleground now felt like home. The HOA that had seemed like an adversary was now a functional organization serving its intended purpose. And Deborah, the antagonist of this entire saga, was hopefully finding peace and better perspective in her new life in South Carolina. I never heard from Deborah again after she moved. No more lawsuits, no angry letters, no drive-by confrontations. I assumed she had moved on and was focusing on her new grandchild and her fresh start. I hoped she had learned something from our conflict, just as I had learned from it. The lessons were not simple or straightforward. Standing up for yourself is important, but so is knowing when you are crossing the line from self-defense to revenge. Documentation and following proper procedures matter enormously when dealing with bureaucratic organizations. And sometimes, one person's unreasonableness can accidentally catalyze positive systemic change. As winter turned to spring once again, I found myself genuinely content with my life in Willow Creek Estates. My work was going well, my house was maintained and comfortable, and my relationships with neighbors were positive and friendly. The dramatic conflict of the previous year had faded into neighborhood lore, occasionally referenced with knowing smiles but no longer a source of active stress. One warm April morning, I was outside planting flowers in my front yard when a moving truck pulled up to Deborah's old house. A young family climbed out, parents in their early 30s with 2 elementary school-age kids. I watched as they looked at their new home with excitement and anticipation. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hi, I am Henry Lawson. I live across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood." The husband shook my hand warmly. "Thanks. I am David. This is my wife Amanda, and these are our kids, Sophie and Lucas. We are so excited to be here. We have heard great things about this community." "It is a good neighborhood," I said honestly. "The HOA is pretty reasonable and most of the neighbors are friendly. If you need anything or have questions as you are settling in, feel free to reach out." "We appreciate that," Amanda said. Our realtor mentioned there had been some HOA drama last year, but that it got resolved and everything is much better now. That was actually reassuring to hear. Shows the community can adapt and improve. I smiled. "Yeah, there was a situation, but it worked out for the best. You folks picked a good time to move in." As I walked back to my own yard, I reflected on how my story would sound to these new neighbors when they eventually heard the full version. It would probably seem bizarre and dramatic, maybe even petty depending on who told it. But the end result was undeniable: a more functional HOA, a happier neighborhood, and one fewer tyrant wielding minor authority like a weapon. The grass grew, the seasons changed, and life in Willow Creek Estates continued peacefully. My oil deliveries came through without interference. My property violations remained non-existent. And every time I adjusted my thermostat, enjoying the reliable warmth of my properly functioning heating system, I remembered the cold nights when that comfort had been threatened by one person's unreasonable exercise of power. I never forgot what I had learned from that experience: that homeowner associations can be forces for good or agents of petty tyranny depending on leadership. That documentation is your best friend when dealing with bureaucracy. That sometimes fighting back is not just about winning but about protecting yourself and potentially others from similar treatment. And that even conflicts that start from pettiness and revenge can sometimes lead to genuinely positive outcomes if handled strategically. Most importantly, I learned that home is not just about the physical structure you live in. It is about the community around you, the people you interact with daily, and the systems that govern your shared spaces. When those systems become oppressive, speaking up is not just your right but your responsibility. As I sit here now, comfortable in my well-heated house, looking out at a neighborhood that functions the way communities should, with mutual respect, reasonable rules, and actual care for residents' well-being, I do not regret anything that happened. Yes, it was stressful. Yes, there were moments when I questioned whether fighting back was worth the hassle. And yes, I sometimes wonder if I could have handled things differently. But ultimately, what happened needed to happen. Deborah needed to face consequences for her abuse of authority. The neighborhood needed to see that challenging, unfair treatment was possible. And the HOA system needed reform that would not have come without a catalyst. The oil delivery incident was that catalyst. What started as a vindictive attempt to make me suffer for questioning her authority became the spark that ignited genuine positive change. And the complaint I filed, calculated and strategic as it was, revealed real safety issues while also applying the same bureaucratic pressure that had been weaponized against me. In the end, justice was served not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through careful documentation, strategic use of existing rules, and persistence in the face of intimidation. The system worked, eventually, once enough light was shone on the abuses occurring within it. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of this entire saga. Systems are only as good as the people running them and the willingness of others to hold those people accountable. When someone abuses their position, whether in an HOA or any other organization, the solution is not to give up or move away. The solution is to document, organize, and fight back using the very rules and procedures that were meant to protect everyone in the first place. Deborah Patterson taught me that lesson through her own negative example. Her downfall came not from my revenge, but from her own inflexibility and unwillingness to treat others with basic respect and fairness. All I did was shine a light on that behavior and force accountability through proper channels. Today, Willow Creek Estates is thriving under Margaret Foster's leadership. Families are happy. Properties are well maintained through voluntary cooperation rather than threatening enforcement. And every winter, oil trucks make their deliveries without interference, keeping homes warm and families comfortable as they should be. That is the real victory, the lasting outcome of that cold week when I nearly froze because one person decided that her authority was more important than my basic needs. The conflict was uncomfortable and sometimes felt petty, but the results speak for themselves. Sometimes standing up to a bully means becoming a bit strategic yourself. Sometimes justice requires using the system against those who have weaponized it. And sometimes, the best revenge is not revenge at all, but simply creating conditions where the same abuse cannot happen to others. As I close this chapter of my life and look forward to whatever comes next, I am grateful for the lessons learned, the friends made, and the community improved. The HOA Karen who blocked my oil access ultimately did me a favor by showing me what happens when good people refuse to stay silent in the face of petty tyranny. And somewhere in South Carolina, I hope Deborah Patterson has learned similar lessons and is treating her new neighbors with more grace and understanding than she showed me. We all deserve second chances and opportunities to do better. Her exile from Willow Creek Estates does not have to define her forever. People can change and grow if they are willing to acknowledge their mistakes. But regardless of whether Deborah ever achieves that growth, I have achieved my own peace. My house is warm, my neighbors are friendly, and my HOA is functional and fair. That cold January week when I watched my heat situation become critical while Deborah smugly blocked my deliveries feels like ancient history now. A story to tell rather than a crisis to manage. The irony remains delicious, though, that Deborah's own house ended up being the one that dropped to freezing temperatures because of safety violations I uncovered. The universe has a funny way of teaching lessons to those who most need to learn them. And the fact that those safety violations were real, not fabricated, makes the entire situation feel less like vindictive payback and more like poetic justice. In the end, everyone got what they needed, if not exactly what they wanted. I got my heat and a better HOA. The neighborhood got improved leadership and fairer enforcement. Tom Brennan got to do his job properly and probably prevented a serious safety incident. And Deborah got a wake-up call about her behavior, along with a fresh start in a new community where hopefully she learned to lead with compassion instead of control. That is my story, how an HOA Karen's decision to block my oil access led to her own house dropping to freezing temperatures and ultimately transformed an entire neighborhood for the better. It is messy, complicated, and probably not how the self-help books say you should handle conflict. But it is real. It is what happened, and I would do it the same way again if I had to. Because some battles are worth fighting, even when they start over something as simple as an oil delivery on a cold winter day.